fantasy was never really a box office powerhouse. Usually, after the success of one film, there followed a parade of failures that would bury the genre for a while. Fantasy had a particularly tough time in the 80s, which saw several massive flops. Many of these films later found their audience and are now considered classics. The stream of failures in the 80s led to the near disappearance of the fantasy genre in the 90s. No one wanted to make movies about pink ponies or about Lords of the Rings in the magical tower. Rare attempts either failed or were genre hybrids. Back then, the average moviegoer could be tricked into going to the theater. The genre was given new life by two franchises at the beginning of the 2000s, Harry Potter and The Lord of the Rings. While the adventures of the little wizard from J.K. Rowling's world were met with optimism and no one counted it out before its release, the situation was different with The Lord of the Rings. It was of absolutely no interest to anyone. So Peter Jackson had to run around Hollywood with his hand out. In some places, the necessary budget was quickly granted, while in others, he refused to accept many of the restrictions they tried to impose on him. When some crazy people finally approved the minimum budget possible, half of Hollywood laughed at them. Everyone expected a major box office failure. But as we now know, things turned out quite differently. The Lord of the Rings became that film that is often cited when people want to emphasize the depth that new cinema has reached. After all, once upon a time, Hollywood was capable of much. And it's worth remembering how Hollywood was able to do that with the help of New Zealand, and how it tried to repeat the success with The Hobbit as well. Peter Jackson took on The Lord of the Rings after the failure of the film The Frighteners. This is one of those films that had excellent test screenings, which, according to Jackson himself and producer Robert Zemeckis, ultimately doomed it. The studio believed too much in the project and scheduled its premiere not for the fall, around Halloween, but for the summer. Jackson and Zemeckis tried to convince them not to do it, but the studio was certain they had a guaranteed hit and that summer would bring in much more money. There was also the adult rating, which would have worked better in the fall. Fall was always a great time for horror films, but Universal Studio didn't listen to Jackson and Zemeckis. If The Frighteners hadn't flopped, The Lord of the Rings might have had a very different home. Peter Jackson's epic film sparked a new surge of interest in the world of Middle-earth. After The Frighteners flopped, Jackson decided to dive into fantasy, initially focusing on some other fantasy story, not directly related to The Lord of the Rings. But, as he later explained, everything he came up with in drafts closely resembled Tolkien's work. Plus, he couldn't find a studio willing to finance his ideas, which were too similar to The Lord of the Rings. The decision was made to somehow acquire the rights to Tolkien's books. The rights were held by a well-known producer, and to his surprise, Miramax Studio agreed that The Lord of the Rings was a good idea. Yes, that very famous producer became interested in the project and saw some potential in it, but he didn't see everything. The studio was willing to invest money in Peter, but with many conditions. They offered options for either a single film, 2 films, or a film based on part of the plot. The rest could be filmed sometime later. For example, in the event of the first film's failure, later turned into never. While they didn't openly discuss the potential failure, it was assumed, and then Peter would be left with only a wooden stake or something even worse. It's believed that Miramax Studio spent around $15 million on pre-production work for the film, and it was at that point that the producers started realizing the full scale of the mess they'd gotten into. Much of the subsequent events became known later, including how the frightening producer forbade casting actresses he didn't like, such as Ashley Judd. When production was halted, the producers quickly ran to Disney's studio asking for a lot of money. Miramax was owned by Disney. In the mid-90s, Disney bought it for $100 million, 40 of which went to pay off the studio's debts. Disney's management, led by Michael Eisner, thought it was all a joke and refused to allocate the couple of $100 million they were asking for. Eisner believed it was going to flop and no one would want to watch it. Peter Jackson was ultimately given the condition: 1 film. However, Jackson managed to negotiate one more thing. He was given 1 month to find a studio that would agree to buy The Lord of the Rings and shoot all 3 films at once. Assuming no one would be crazy enough, they gave him the time. Later, there would be many discussions that if anyone had known that Jackson would find a new studio, Miramax wouldn't have let him go and might have even agreed to his terms, but everyone thought Jackson would crawl back. Naturally, these stories emerged after the film's success, so no one can say for sure what's true. In the end, it turned out to be a very clever move. When Jackson found Miramax, he had nothing to offer to entice potential investors, or rather, the minimal budget he could afford from his own money. It was something like a coloring book and grandiose gesturing. When he ran around Hollywood with Miramax's permission, he already had a prototype for $15 million. So the preparations were much more advanced, and now he could back up his hand-waving and stories about how great everything would be with something tangible. Agree, the task became much easier. There are also various rumors that Jackson was going to be replaced by Quentin Tarantino if he couldn't find a buyer and insisted on filming 2 or 3 movies. It sounds crazy, but seeing The Lord of the Rings directed by Quentin Tarantino would be quite interesting, though most likely he would have turned it down. Jackson himself believes that these were just scary tales aimed at him, to make him stop whining and agree to all the producer's demands. But although the task became easier, many studios still turned down Jackson's offers. There was one that took a long time to decide, the same Universal Studios. As mentioned before, if The Scarecrow had been a box office success, they might have thought it over more carefully and agreed, but they weren't in a rush to respond. And Jackson didn't have time. His travels to studio offices were interrupted by New Line Cinema. What's most amusing is that they agreed to buy the project and offered to make 3 films instead of the 2 that Jackson had suggested. The official version is just like that. New Line's CEO, Robert Shea, decided that 3 is better than 2. However, at first, they agreed to allocate $180 million for the trilogy, $60 million per film, which at the time wasn't a lot, but also wasn't too little for a trilogy that they planned to shoot non-stop. So it turned out to be some kind of savings. Peter Jackson invested nearly all of his money into The Lord of the Rings. He had already mortgaged part of his assets during the shooting of The Scarecrow. But for The Lord of the Rings, his company Weta FX didn't have enough resources, so he had to invest everything that was left. Many problems arose with the actors, or rather with the actors that Jackson wanted to see in his film, but didn't. One of them was Sean Connery, who was offered the role of Gandalf. First, they offered him $10 million, then 15% of the future box office revenue. There are many versions of why he declined. Either the money wasn't enough, or Sean didn't understand the role, or the prospect of living in New Zealand for a year and a half. It's not The Matrix, from which the Scotsman also turned down, and what he didn't understand is unclear. So, most likely it was about the money. 2 versions might have merged into one. But, for example, Sean didn't believe in the success of the project, and living in New Zealand for a year and a half for $10 million, or 15% of what was likely to be nothing, wasn't part of his plans. Jackson wanted Daniel Day-Lewis for the role of Aragorn, but he said that he preferred films that challenged him, and running around with prosthetic ears or a nose didn't sound challenging at all. So Jackson quickly dismissed that idea. Then Russell Crowe surfaced. He too has a couple of versions of why he turned it down. Usually they point to his other commitments that got in the way. But there's also a version with a money bag that he wasn't offered, but very much wanted. Without that bag of money, he became very busy. In the end, Aragorn was played by Stuart Townsend. Nowadays, no one remembers him, but at the time, he considered himself an up-and-coming talent and was willing to work for food that he would bring himself. So they signed him, especially since, during the auditions, he wielded a saber quite skillfully, and everyone decided that, if you didn't look too closely, the guy seemed quite suitable. They quickly found a professional who taught him how to handle the saber and roll. It took several months to prepare him. Those who watched the film probably noticed something was off. Something was off with Stuart Townsend. In the first days of shooting, it became clear that compared to the Hobbits, he looked rather unimposing, although the main idea was precisely that. He was supposed to look like just another ordinary Hobbit. A week into filming, nobody could stand this Aragorn anymore, so Jackson and the producers showed Townsend the door. They started calling Daniel Day-Lewis again, offering him millions of dollars, a percentage of the box office, and a separate trailer for more refined pursuits. Daniel Day-Lewis refused again. And only then, when it was decided that they'd have to take anyone for the role, someone from the producers remembered about such a person, Viggo Mortensen. Viggo also supposedly didn't want to act, but his own children convinced him, and so he eventually agreed. Mortensen later went on to cause Peter Jackson a lot of problems. The actor was a big fan of surfing, so on his days off, he liked to find a bigger wave and feel his greatness. But he came across a particularly nasty New Zealand wave that didn't see much potential in Viggo. The actor was thrown around pretty badly, and somewhere down there, he had to leave half of his face behind, which meant he had a working side for some of the filming days, and Peter Jackson made sure to film that side intensively. The other side had to be repaired for a month. Only the Hobbit roles didn't cause many issues. They took anyone who happened to be available. According to various stories, Elijah Wood showed up for his audition in his grandmother's ragged clothes and a wig, accompanied by his friends who were also dressed in the latest Middle-earth fashion. They all performed different sketches, and Jackson, to stop this nightmare, agreed to sign Wood. Ian McKellen said that he hadn't read The Lord of the Rings and didn't really want to act in a film like this either. But by that time, Peter Jackson was already set on Elijah Wood. He waved his arms in front of Ian so quickly and shouted so fiercely that Ian was convinced this kind of guy could at least make something memorable. Orlando Bloom, who no one needed at that time, was also hired through an open casting call. The actor was still attending drama school and had to take an academic leave for a couple of years. Initially, he was supposed to have a smaller role since Bloom wanted to play Faramir, which he had auditioned for. But after a while, his role was upgraded and he had to endure over a year of filming. The Hobbit town was built a year before the filming. For an entire year, sheep were driven around the roads to regulate the grass height, which made the landscape look natural. You can compare it to the latest Lord of the Rings series and its grand battle at the tavern. It's easy to spot the widespread use of props, even though the series was worked on for 2 years, so it's hard to say there was any rush involved. It seems like the issue lies with the real professionals. There used to be fewer of them in Hollywood. All 3 films were shot simultaneously, so the entire production took over a year. It sounds intense, but for 3 films, it's not that much time. Once a big expert on long shoots, Francis Ford Coppola spent almost as long on just one film, Apocalypse Now. The script was supposedly ready, but it turned out to be the wrong one. So, in true Gladiator style, it was rewritten, and new parts were added as the filming went on. Naturally, everyone improvised on the fly, even when they didn't really want to. Like that moment when Gandalf tested the ceiling beams with his forehead for durability, or sometimes an idea would come up later, and a bad idea would be scrapped. The films could have been a little cheaper, which, from today's perspective, seems pretty funny when looking at the trilogy's budget. Those $60 million per film gradually turned into $90 million per film. But when a lot of it was shot and the producers were shown the footage and some visual effects, they threw more money at Jackson without making a big deal out of it. The studio had few conditions and barely interfered with the process. One of their conditions was a prologue to explain to those unfamiliar with the books where all the noise was coming from. Jackson agreed and delivered a 10-minute prologue. It had to be shortened. The final cut is just under 8 minutes. Jackson filmed enough material for 10 movies. It turned out that way because several shooting crews worked on the project simultaneously. While Jackson was working with actors, others were filming forests or extras running through them. The first cut of The Fellowship of the Ring ran 4.5 hours. Naturally, they asked to trim it down as much as possible. The final cut ended up being just under 3 hours. The first film of the trilogy hit theaters in December 2001, and by the first weekend, it was clear to everyone. In just the US, the film grossed $66 million. Today, that doesn't sound too impressive, but in 2001, no film had made over $100 million in its opening weekend at home. So, that $66 million was a very solid number. The Fellowship of the Ring ended its theatrical run with $880 million, against a budget of $93 million. Later, with various re-releases, the film would go on to gross another $20 million or so. By the way, there's an interesting tidbit about Peter Jackson. Many people probably heard that the main actors got tattoos with the Elvish number 9. They did that before the movie even premiered. Peter Jackson joined them only after the film's release, when critics were drowning in praise. Jackson, in general, never hid the fact that he was nervous, so he waited before getting the tattoo. After the film's success, reshoots for the second and third films were organized. Their budgets, too, gradually increased to around $90 million. If the first movie had flopped, the second and third films would have turned out quite differently and lost a lot of scale. Thanks to the new influx of funds, Jackson was able to shoot some large additional scenes. Andy Serkis, whose Gollum appears in the second film, was originally not meant to play the character, so in the first film, Gollum looks a bit different. Since visual effects work started right as the footage was shot, by the time Andy Serkis joined the cast, Gollum and his scenes for the first film were already done. They didn't bother to redo them. Although Jackson often jokes that someday, in true Star Wars fashion, he might change a few episodes that were affected by such nuances. Because of Gollum, the creation of The Lord of the Rings nearly brought in George Lucas's studio. The character was supposed to be very complex, and New Line didn't believe that Jackson's studio would be able to pull it off. They were only convinced by a test version with Andy Serkis, which was different from the one made for the first film. The Two Towers hit theaters in December 2002 and ultimately grossed $948 million worldwide. The money started pouring in. It's claimed that the final shot of Return of the King was filmed after the movie had already hit theaters. Peter Jackson just thought it would be fun. The scene didn't make it into the theatrical version for obvious reasons, but it's included in the extended edition of the trilogy. Of the scenes that did make it into the final film, the last one was filmed just a week before the movie's theatrical release. Jackson insisted that he saw the fully completed film for the first time only at the premiere. The third film was overwhelmed with Oscars. It won 11 awards. In total, the Lord of the Rings trilogy received 30 nominations. This is more than any other film series. As for its box office, Return of the King grossed $1.155 billion. The movie also set a new worldwide opening record, taking in over $250 million in its first weekend. The official total budget for the trilogy was $500 million. That's how much New Line spent in the end. About $300 million went into production, and the remaining money was spent on marketing. Nowadays, that's not a lot for 3 films, and a $100 million marketing budget is pretty standard for an average blockbuster. But back in the early 2000s, spending around $70 million on marketing for a $90 million movie was a huge amount. Only record-breaking films like Godzilla, Emmerich, or Titanic, Cameron, had bigger marketing budgets. However, the average $90 million spent per film doesn't reflect all the money that went into production. Exact figures were never disclosed. But due to tax incentives in New Zealand, the studio was able to recoup part of the costs. Typically, the budget listed publicly reflects the amount after these tax incentives have been applied. It's claimed that The Lord of the Rings received 10 times the annual budget of New Zealand's Film Commission, which oversees the distribution of tax credits in the country. The annual budget of the Film Commission is estimated to be between $5 and $7 million. So, with the incentives, they could have recouped about $50 million. This means the actual budget per film would have been around $110 to $115 million. Some rumors suggest the figure could have been even higher. These little tricks allow studios to manipulate their payout percentages. This can affect the success of the movie, which later led to Jackson not receiving some of his bonuses and eventually suing New Line over it. At that point, it became clear that the Lord of the Rings trilogy wasn't a successful venture at all. It was actually a complete failure. The films cost more than expected, crazy amounts were spent on marketing, and New Line had to pay a hefty distribution percentage. Yes, to itself, but legally, since the production company and the distribution company were different entities. And in the end, it seemed that Peter Jackson wasn't owed anything by anyone. When documents were reviewed, it turned out that there wasn't really any success to speak of. The DVD sales made just a few dollars, and that came many years later. Peter Jackson was far from insignificant, though. So, as usual, behind closed doors, the issues were settled. Jackson's initial reluctance to work on The Hobbit is often linked to these events. This doesn't mean that the studio didn't issue any bonuses. The main actors received bonuses ranging from $300,000 to $500,000 for each film. These figures can be viewed in different ways, especially when you consider how much the films would have lost if all the actors had been replaced. Imagine The Lord of the Rings with Russell Crowe instead of Viggo Mortensen or Sean Connery instead of Ian McKellen. The Hobbit could have happened back in the early 2000s when Jackson first thought about adapting The Lord of the Rings. The first film was supposed to be The Hobbit. This was when Miramax was still working on the project, but there were issues with the rights. While securing the rights for The Lord of the Rings was straightforward, acquiring the rights for The Hobbit proved much more complicated. Some of the rights were owned by one party, while others were with a different one. MGM and a well-known producer had been trying to negotiate, but during those years, MGM went bankrupt once again. So they didn't have time to deal with such small things. As a result, the idea of adapting The Hobbit had to be abandoned. The project was revisited only after the success of the Lord of the Rings trilogy. In 2005, there was a lot of talk, and Peter Jackson himself was planning to direct the film. By then, MGM had gone bankrupt and had revived itself again. Now, there were no problems with the rights. But that's when Jackson started demanding money from New Line, and everyone got upset with him. The head of New Line even called Jackson ungrateful and greedy and announced that the studio would never work with someone like him again. However, the success of The Lord of the Rings was just too big. Or rather, its failure. Everyone wanted to make the Hobbit films and fall into the same trap once again. So, in 2007, Jackson was brought back on board and everyone made amends, especially after Peter, behind closed doors, received a few million for The Lord of the Rings. He quickly developed a genuine fondness for everyone involved and was ready to work. But when things started moving, he was busy and only agreed to be a talented producer. Jackson had just acquired the rights to Mortal Engines and wanted to direct that instead. Guillermo del Toro was brought in as the director for The Hobbit. However, he famously said that he couldn't stand hobbits and despised dragons even more. This convinced everyone that Guillermo del Toro was the ideal candidate. However, another potential director considered was David Yates. The talented director who had helmed the final Harry Potter films and the Fantastic Beasts trilogy seemed like a promising choice. So things could have turned out really well. Although Del Toro wasn't exactly a fan of The Hobbit, he dived into the project wholeheartedly. He created thousands of storyboards, designed all the creatures, and even shot test footage for the future film. Del Toro worked on The Hobbit for about 2 years. Peter Jackson supported him throughout the process, looking at the colorful designs and expressing how happy he was to collaborate with Del Toro. But in 2010, MGM once again decided to go bankrupt, and the film's development stalled. After spending 2 years on the project, Del Toro grew tired of waiting and decided to leave. Naturally, there are different versions of what exactly happened. Del Toro was not exactly a box office director. His style was more niche, and people were concerned about that. A few months after Del Toro's departure, Jackson agreed to step in as the director. Work immediately kicked off again. It's likely that they were simply afraid of making a $200 million Hobbit movie with Del Toro at the helm. They probably pushed Jackson to take over. Jackson had only 6 months to prepare for the shoot, which he claims is why the films ended up being uneven in quality. He didn't have enough time to finish the script, he didn't have time to do the storyboards. So, on set, they had to come up with ideas on the fly for what and how to shoot. He couldn't communicate properly with the actors he wanted for the film. He didn't have time to prepare shooting locations. He was falling behind on everything, but had to shoot because there was no choice. Philippa Boyens, who was responsible for the Hobbit script, mentioned that Del Toro had a completely different script, which would have been much more fairy tale-like. Bilbo would have been entirely different under Del Toro's vision. He would have been a confused younger guy, but under Jackson, Bilbo turned into a glowing 40-year-old Martin Freeman. According to the book, Bilbo was about 35 years old, so Freeman wasn't exactly too old for the role. Initially, Jackson shot material for 2 films, as originally planned, but after reviewing the rough footage, the studio convinced Jackson to expand it into a massive trilogy. Some scenes and episodes from the first and second films were cut and moved into the third one. Plus, there were 2 additional months of shooting. A strong script was written for the Battle of the Five Armies, incorporating various notes and explanations that Tolkien had left for The Lord of the Rings and his other works. An Unexpected Journey hit theaters in December 2012. The budget for it was twofold. Sometimes the figure of $200 million is mentioned, but that's without factoring in Del Toro's version. With his involvement, the budget soared to $315 million. It managed to gross $1,017 million worldwide. At that point, the main struggle between the second and third films was taking place. Constant changes were happening, and there were even some minor reshoots, as they couldn't quite stitch everything together properly, and test audiences were falling asleep. The film also introduced a love triangle, which was later forced into the story. Orlando Bloom was added to the mix. Initially, he just ran around occasionally and showed little to no interest in Evangeline Lilly's character. However, the studio was not satisfied with the existing romantic dynamic, so they demanded that Orlando be included. Peter Jackson resisted, but ultimately gave in. He often expressed his dissatisfaction in interviews, although the love story itself was his idea. Jackson had wanted to bring Evangeline Lilly into the film and created this subplot specifically for her. The Desolation of Smaug was initially allocated a budget of $250 million. However, due to additional shoots and reshoots, the original $200 million budget was inflated. The second Hobbit film hit theaters in December 2013, but it didn't quite reach the $1 billion mark. It grossed $959 million. Even with such a huge budget for 2013, the film still performed well. Whether The Hobbit ultimately failed on paper is still unclear. No lawsuits have been filed as of yet. The situation with the Battle of the Five Armies is the most complex. The film was made simply because it had to be, which is why it is considered the most cut film out of all 6 in Jackson's series. Its runtime ended up being the shortest in the entire series. Some scenes that were cut from the theatrical version can still be seen in trailers. Jackson has often been quoted saying he refused to watch the final version of the Battle of the Five Armies due to his reluctance to see what the studio had done to it. Peter Jackson himself has never officially confirmed such statements. It's possible they were fabricated by less than reliable sources, who often hear things. After all, many found it hard to believe that Peter Jackson was truly responsible for the Hobbit films. It sounded better to think he was simply forced into it. The rush and constant rewrites ultimately led to the Battle of the Five Armies being the only one of Jackson's Middle-earth films not nominated for an Oscar for visual effects. The film received just one nomination, for sound editing. The Battle of the Five Armies hit theaters in December 2014 with a budget estimated at $300 million. It grossed $962 million, which is still a very solid number. However, considering the costs, the new trilogy brought far less profit to the studio. Given that New Line and Warner Brothers had to share revenue with MGM and the Tolkien estate, the net earnings may have been quite small. In this context, the studio's tricks with The Hobbit might not seem so strange or laughable. It would be nice to say that this is one of the rare film series where a consistent high standard was maintained across 6 films, but that's not the case. Blame falls on Jackson, who agreed to shoot on the fly, and the studio, which unexpectedly demanded 3 films. Without a solid script, even for 2, expecting something extraordinary from 3 films was difficult. However, if in 2014 it seemed that the series had lost something compared to the Lord of the Rings trilogy, we were recently reminded that things could have been much worse. Amazon released The Rings of Power, and after just the first episode, it seemed like things couldn't get worse. But the creators promised to top the iconic Battle of the Helm's Deep from the first season, and for better or worse, they managed to do just that. It's worth noting that while The Lord of the Rings might not be to everyone's taste, no film is universally loved, but the influence and significance of the series are undeniable and impossible to ignore. The Lord of the Rings will still be remembered in 20 years as one of the most important representations of the fantasy genre. It's like Blade Runner for cyberpunk, but on the scale of fantasy. Thank you for your attention. Stay tuned.